Hey everybody, so today we're going to look at events at the end of the Great War and how the Allies negotiate peace and whether or not that was successful. So I've got our unit questions up here that we're going to be talking about at the end of the unit, and for today's particular class we're going to be looking at just wrapping up the end of the Great War, talking about this Paris Peace Conference and some of the sources that we're reading, looking at Wilson's 14 points, the League of Nations, the Treaty of Versailles, the Weimar Constitution that creates the Weimar Republic, and then what's coming up next time. So, the Great War truly was a world war, and so you can see all the green countries are with the Allies, and the orange countries are with the Central Powers, Austria-Hungary, Germany, the Ottoman Empire. And so this is just a couple of images from the Great War. You can see soldiers. These are Belgian troops who are wearing early versions of gas masks. And you can see that these gas masks don't look like they're very effective. And there were lots of gas attacks throughout the war. And so here are some English troops who have been attacked with gas, and they're actually blind. And so they're having to hold each other's arms as they walk forward. Just some statistics on how devastating the war was. So I'm going to get you all this at one time. 65 million soldiers mobilized, 8.5 million killed, 22 million wounded, many of them losing limbs and things like this. Very debilitating. And what that equals out to is about 6,000 people each day who were dying over the course of more than 1,500 days. So a lot of death and destruction. This war was the worst thing that people had ever experienced. And a lot of that has to do with themes we've talked about, the buildup of nationalism and militarism. And so you end up with so much devastation that they never could have imagined. The fighting actually stops with the armistice on November the 11th, 1918. So it was at 11 a.m. on the 11th day of the 11th month, 11/11/11. That's when the fighting stops. But wars do not officially end until there is a treaty. So the Paris Peace Conference comes in 1919. And that is designed to lay out the terms of the peace treaty and try to rebuild the world moving forward. Some of the key players at the Paris Peace Conference include, for the British, you've got David Lloyd George; for the French, Georges Clemenceau; and for the Americans, Woodrow Wilson. So we're actually going to focus a lot here on Woodrow Wilson. Wilson, if you look at his 14 points, what is he calling for leading up to the peace conference? One of the things that he highlights in his 14 points is something that he is most known for. It's this concept of self-determination. I want to point out Wilson was not the only person who talked about self-determination, but he's the person who really becomes attached to this term. And what this means in general terms is that if a nation respects equal rights and equal opportunities for its people, then that nation should have the right to exist, and it should be free to choose its own government without outside interference. So Wilson wants several things at the Paris Peace Conference. He wants there to be open diplomacy, no more secret treaties, because that really created the domino effect that led to World War I. He wants to establish the League of Nations, which we'll talk about in a moment. He does want to push for the right of self-determination. But I'll come back to that in a second. He wants to have free trade and freedom of the seas, and he wants to make sure that there are no punitive measures against the defeated powers. He doesn't want Germany to be punished severely. So these are some of the things that Wilson really wanted at the Paris Peace Conference. But I want to go ahead and point out, he's not going to get most of this. And especially with the right of self-determination, I want to take a moment to pause here. When Wilson puts out this call for nations should basically be free to govern themselves, he only means that for specific European nations. He doesn't mean that for places throughout Asia or Africa. And so once those countries realize Wilson doesn't really mean for this universal idea to apply to them, they think he's hypocritical and they become disillusioned. But let's look at the League of Nations. So this is the 14th point out of the 14 points. And Wilson says that he wants a general association of nations that must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. And this is the League of Nations. If you look at the covenant of the League of Nations, the one thing you should focus on is, what was the League of Nations designed to do? I'm going to show you a map of the world, and it shows all the different countries of the world and whether or not they were part of the League of Nations. So just look for the dark blue countries. The dark blue, navy blue countries were part of the League of Nations. The gray countries were not part of the League of Nations. This is an animated GIF file, so it begins in 1920 and it goes up to 1945. And we'll look through this a couple of times because you may need some extra time to kind of see what happens. 1920. Here we go, 1920. 1921, move ahead of the way. So most of Europe is part of the League of Nations, most of South America, Canada, parts of Asia. But as we get into the 1930s, the makeup is going to start changing here. You'll start to see countries turning gray, or the USSR turns navy blue in the 1930s. And then more and more countries are pulling out. More and more countries are pulling out, and by the time you get to 45, it's a shell of what it used to be. Now, I'm going to highlight some countries this time as we go along. So, look at Germany. You should see Germany right here. They're not even allowed to join until 1926. That didn't really help the League of Nations legitimacy. Look here in 1933. 1933, Germany pulls out, and so does Japan. Both those countries pulled out in 1933. There's a reason for that. And the USSR joined, I mentioned that. But as the war is raging here by 1939, more and more countries pull out. And I'm not going to play all the way through again, but I do want to point out, if you've not been paying attention, you might have noticed this already. The USA is always gray. We never joined the League of Nations. Go back and watch it again and you'll see that. There's a political cartoon that is called The Gap in the Bridge, and it says this League of Nations bridge was designed by the President of the USA. And you can see on the bridge, you've got Belgium and France and England and Italy. And the keystone is the USA, but Uncle Sam is not part of it. So, the League of Nations failed in part because the United States never joined it. There were some other flaws with the League of Nations. It lacked a lot of enforcement abilities, but the League of Nations no longer exists. It officially died out in 1946, and its successor is the United Nations, which we still have today. But I think the USA, if it had joined the League of Nations, that organization would have been far more successful, even though it did have some underlying flaws. At least it would have been a more legitimate organization with U.S. participation. Now, moving on to the Treaty of Versailles. This is the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles Palace. Okay, and you can see all the mirrors on the walls, the paintings on the ceiling, the glass chandeliers. A very, very ornate room in the Versailles Palace. And if you look at this drawing that shows the Treaty of Versailles being signed, you can actually make out Woodrow Wilson here in the painting. You can see George Clemenceau with that big walrus mustache, and here's David Lloyd George from the British. And all these Allied powers are watching as the representatives of the Weimar Republic are being forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles. They don't have a choice. They must sign this treaty. But it's interesting that the Allies choose the Hall of Mirrors for this signing ceremony, because it's the exact same place where Germany declared its unification, its victory over France in 1871. This is another painting of Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, and in the Hall of Mirrors. It's not a coincidence that the Allies, they remembered that Germany declared its unification, its victory over France in the Franco-Prussian War here in 1871, and so the Allies are going to have Germany accepting defeat in the exact same place. If you look at the Treaty of Versailles, what is your reaction to this treaty? What did it actually do? Was it fair? And who gained the most from the treaty and who lost the most? The thing that we normally focus on is Article 231. It's called the War Guilt Clause. And it says here that the Allied and associated governments affirm, and Germany accepts the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies. This is so interesting because it was Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian Serb who assassinated the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The Austro-Hungarian government sends an ultimatum to Serbia. Serbia refuses. Austria-Hungary declares war. But Germany must accept all responsibility for the war. The War Guilt Clause is the thing most people focus on. What they don't focus on are Articles 227 to 230 that came directly before the War Guilt Clause. And I highlight those because there was actually an attempt by the Allies to put the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, on trial. It never happened. He was never put on trial, in part because he fled and went to the Netherlands and lived out the rest of his life there, and the Dutch refused to extradite him. But I find it interesting that the Allies wanted to hold a trial for a head of state. And I mention that now because we're going to talk about the Nuremberg trial very soon. And it's interesting that there was at least an attempt to hold a government official responsible for the war. And they were going to put him on trial, but it never actually happened. And then here's Kaiser Wilhelm II. This is an image near the end of his life in 1933. Where he's just enjoying exile. If you look at the map of Europe before World War I, I'm going to highlight a few things. Germany is much larger before the war. So is Russia, by the way. Russia is much larger. There's an Austro-Hungarian Empire here. There's an Ottoman Empire. If you look at the war, after the war, Germany is smaller. There's an East Prussia now, but Germany is smaller. The country of Poland has been created again, and so the Polish, they split up Germany, so the Polish can have access to the Baltic Sea. The Soviet Union is now in place instead of Russia, and they don't have as much territory because Poland was created out of the former Russian Empire, along with Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. There is no more Ottoman Empire. It's now Turkey. And then if you go back, you'll actually see that the parts of Austro-Hungarian Empire end up becoming Yugoslavia, and that's going to be really important later as well. I like this map as well because it shows the demilitarized zone of Alsace-Lorraine and the Rhineland, and that's all going to play an important role going into what happens with World War II. If you look at the Weimar Constitution, what rights did the document guarantee to citizens, and what kind of government did this Constitution establish? The Weimar Constitution, the Weimar Republic, the Treaty of Versailles, all of these things lead a very bad taste in the mouth of one Adolf Hitler, who actually served in World War I and was disgusted by the events that he saw happening to Germany. And so, for next time, we're going to be looking at the rise of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. We have various readings here that I'd like for you to look at. There's a crash course video you can look at. along with a quiz from the textbook. So, that's all I've got time for, ladies and gentlemen. I'll see you online.